This is the third video for lesson 18. In video 1 we talked about tables. Video 2 we talked about graphs. Video 3 we're going to go ahead and talk about equations. So Google of course is figuring out not by magic but it's figuring out with math. So when I wanted to take my Fahrenheit and then convert it to Celsius, there's actually an equation for that. And that equation is C is equal to F minus 32 times 5 over 9. So what the calculator in Google is basically doing is taking my value, say for example 32, plugging into this formula, 32 minus 32, that's equal to 0. 0 times anything is equal to 0. So that means my Celsius degrees is 0 in this case. Okay, so if Google has this formula for Celsius, the question is there a formula for Fahrenheit, to find Fahrenheit given the Celsius? So it's not magic. In fact, they just go ahead and figure this out. And we're going to see if we can figure out that equation where when we are given the Celsius, how can we find the Fahrenheit? So Fahrenheit is equal to something based on Celsius. And this would be the equation that my roommate Camille will want to use. If she's trying to figure out Fahrenheit and she doesn't have Google with her, how can she change this formula around such that we know what the Fahrenheit is based on the Celsius? And it might be more obvious now just because of the variables I've written them in. Because here we have C is equal to something. You do something to F to get to C. Well, in this case, what we want is F is equal to some operation on C. So what we can do is we can just go ahead and solve for F. So when we go ahead and solve for F, the first thing is I want to reverse this multiplication. So reversing that multiplication would imply multiplying it by the reciprocal. So reciprocal. So let me go ahead and show my work down here so it's a little bit less cluttered. So the reciprocal of 5 over 9 is 9 over 5. So I can multiply both sides by 9 over 5. The 5 nines cancels out with the 9 over 5. And I'm left with F minus 32 is equal to 9 over 5 times C. Now I still need to solve for F, and I can go ahead and do that by adding 32 on both sides. So when I add 32 on both sides, I'm left with F is equal to 9 over 5C plus 32. Take a look. That means our function here, our inverse function is Fahrenheit is equal to 9 over 5C plus 32. And that is my inverse function. So if this is my original function, and I want to make this note, is here the input is F, and the output is C. But I want to get it to the point where F is the output, and the input is C. And the reason why I want to do that is just a different perspective. Like Camille, my friend, will use this. I will want to use this so I can communicate with her. So we take a look at this equation. Now here we have the output F, and we could input a Celsius to find the Fahrenheit. And that's how you deal with equations for inverse functions. The x and y's are just switched. Let me give you another example that is away from the whole Celsius and Fahrenheit example. If I was given the equation f of x is equal to, say for example, x plus 3. Based on our table, we would know that when I plug in 1, I get 1 plus 3, which is equal to 4. Now, if this was my function, then my inverse function, denoted by this -1, that -1 means inverse. What would happen when I take the output value 4? Or what if I take the output value here and then plug it into my inverse? So now this is the input for my inverse function. This will give me that 1 back out. So this is just saying, if this is x, this is f of x, and I plug in 1, I get 4 back out. And my inverse function, when I plug in x, my inverse function would give me 1 back out. So they're opposites of each other. And much in the same way, when you graph it, you'll see that one has a point at 1, 4, and the other graph has a point at 4, 1. these 2 points are points on the inverse function. Now, what happens to the equation inverse function of f? How can we solve for that equation? Well, if we go ahead and just take this is our output, this is our input. Now we're going to switch it. So if we were to switch it, I would get x here is equal to f of x plus 3. And the question is, how do I solve for my output f of x? Well, I can just subtract 3 on both sides. And I get f of x is equal to x minus 3. And therefore, the inverse function of x plus 3 is x minus 3. So don't forget the step of switching the input and output. And that is the equation part of our inverse functions lesson.